that was really important to me. Like Space Between Stars is a game that I made after I had just taken a year off of college because I was terrified of, my abilities and like the pressures of academia and like various other stuff. And so like Space Between Stars being a game about failing forward was really important to me.
Welcome to the Draw Your Dice podcast, the show that calls on the champions and new contenders of the tabletop RPG arena. My name is Jeremy Gage, and I am learning about tabletop game design and publishing. If you are a budding game designer or a veteran looking for fresh musings, stay tuned as we learn about the inspirations, processes, and philosophies of professionals in the industry. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Draw Your Dice podcast. As you heard in the intro, I'm Jeremy Gage. Thanks for hanging out. You can always find me at JeremyGage5. But today is not about me. It is about the MC of the I'd Play That Game podcast, game show, or stream game show, a player on the most recent Season 3 Quarter Zone Station with all nerds here, and host of... this is their name, Viditya Voleti Variety Show. Let's welcome Viditya Voleti.
Hello, everybody. It's me. I'm here. Ooh, thank you. Thank you. Big fans.
There's like a big portion of the show where they just get to miss out on the video that's happening for the two of us. But I love the energy.
I'm a gesture. You're gonna see.
Yeah.
There's a lot that's missed.
Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. As always, I like to start this show with a brief introduction of who you are and your journey into game design. So why don't you give a little intro on where you're currently at in your life, and then also touch on what may have been your first role-playing game that really got you interested in the discipline, and then what was sort of the first game that got you into game design.
Okay. Yeah. So, currently I'm a designer. I do a bunch of stuff. I think I currently market myself as I'm a full freelance games designer, and that's really great and fun that I can say that. But it's been a long journey. I feel like I don't have this extensive lore that a lot of other people do with tabletop games, mostly because I'm on the younger side of the tabletop scene. So I got into tabletop games. Here, this is the real start of it. I've always wanted to work in games. So ever since I was a kid, I've always wanted to work in games. I thought video games. I love video games, and I was like, I want to make them. I want to be a part of that. But I hated coding, and I'm a talented artist. I've always been an artsy kid growing up, and I had lucky to have parents who helped foster that. Right? They were like, yeah, this is what you're good at. Let's help you get through that. So for a lot of my life, I wanted to work in game arts and things like that. And then around high school, I was like, I want to start making my own games, but I don't want to code. So I would make little mini games in Minecraft or other kind of in-engine things, right? And then kind of pivoted to board games and stuff, because I was like, well, I can make tabletop games that kind of function like video games, right? I still game design, and that was really fun. So I kind of did that, and then I started learning about role-playing games, and I was like, I want to try that. But then I played a bunch of board games with my friends. I kind of say that I officially say that my in to tabletop games was through Fantasy Flight's Descent Journeys in the Dark 2nd edition, which is a hybrid board game, role-playing game kind of thing. You don't have to role-play, but there's a bunch of story elements, and you play characters, and depending on what boards you set up, the story can go in different ways. So it was this whole thing. Some old friends of mine that I would play that with, we ended up started making our own characters, our own classes. We just started hacking Descent until eventually we were we should just play a role-playing game. We're basically doing that. And then I guess officially my first role-playing game was Dragons 3.5. I played a small campaign of that with some high school friends, and it got kind of muddled because we were seniors and we went to college, and I had a very busy college life. I went to an art school. It's a hell of a freshman year. terrifying. And so I was like, I just can't play like 6-hour sessions on like online and stuff like that. It was just really bad. But then I got really into Pathfinder as well because I could play like short bursts of Pathfinder. And that like, so I stuck with Pathfinder for a while. Like when I feel like my DNA for design and role-playing games is Pathfinder, and I could talk about that game for a long time. Pros and cons. There's like a lot that I like about Pathfinder that I don't think it does well. Or like the things that it does well, I don't enjoy playing the things that it doesn't, and so on and so forth. But then during college, I got a degree in game design, so I guess like qualifications is I have like I get to say like, ooh, I have like a BFA in interactive arts and game design, so I know what I'm talking about if you care about that. But like there are also like much smarter designers than me who didn't pay a ridiculous amount of money to say that. But like I took game design, so I was learning a lot about play specifically. Like the thing that I really like about what my college gave me was it didn't just like push me through to coding and like making like literally making games. It was like, what is play, what is interaction, and like our intro to game design class wasn't like learning game maker, it was instead making board games. Like the first thing you do is you learn to make board games. And so I was like fiddling with tabletop design, I was fiddling with like a bunch of like, you know, physical interaction. And like all this time I was also playing Pathfinder. I was introducing my college friends to Pathfinder. I was the GM for like 10 people. It was horrible. It was like, to be honest, it was like horrible. I was running like 2 different groups each week, and it was like so much. I tried to do like a mixed group kind of before I knew what West Marches was. I tried to do a West Marches game where I was like, drop in and out. Like any of these fucking 10 friends can jump in and out of the session, and I'll just do it once a week. That died very quickly because a lot of people were like, we don't like we don't get it. And we all got really busy. But so like I ended up taking a semester off from college because of mental health reasons, and just it was a lot. And during that time, I was like, I want to explore role-playing games. Like, I want to figure out how to make them, and I found this really wonderful, like, local Baltimore tabletop group event. It was called Drinking and Dragons. Oh my god, I can't believe I forgot it for a second. It was called Drinking and Dragons because we met at a bar. We met at like a creative bar space called the Wind Up Space, which is closed down a few years ago, which really sucks. But it was a really wonderful space, and like I would go there, and that was my first introduction to indie games. Basically, I was like, oh, because like Pathfinder and 5e, maybe there was like a 5e game being run there, but basically it was like a pitch circle. So you can go in and like some people will be like, I have a game I want to run, and it's like 4 to 5 hours, and you get to like play these different games. And so people brought some really cool stuff. Like this is my first time where I was like, oh my god, like what is Blades in the Dark? What is, somebody was running like Spire, somebody was running Torchbearer. Like there's like a bunch of like Fiasco was being run there a lot. So it's like all these like names that now I feel like everybody knows, but I was like, what the fuck is this? And the first indie game that I think I played was The Witch is Dead, which is a 1-page game by Grant Howitt. And I played it, and I had an absolute blast. And I was like, and this was also, sorry, my timeline's all over the place. But like I said, this is like, I took a semester off. I wanted to make role-playing games, and I was already sketching up something. And it was big. It was like, you could clearly tell it was like my only touchstone is Pathfinder. And then I played The Witch is Dead, just a 1-page game. And I was like, hold the phone. You can make like a game, like you can make a role-playing game that fits on a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and it is fulfilling and fun, and like you tell a great story. And it was just like, there it is, the gates were open, right? And like then it's kind of history. Like it was just like I was playing a bunch of games, I was reading a bunch of games, I started designing smaller stuff, I started redesigning my bigger stuff, like. And then, like, you know, as this goes on, like, I took a year off. I came back. I made my thesis. My thesis for my college is a tabletop RPG. It's called Space Between Stars. So I had the...
We're talking about it later.
I, like, had the... like, and this is, like, I always want to be very upfront about this. I had the privilege, the absolute privilege of being able to do this for college. So, like, a lot of my time was spent playing games, reading games, and making games, which means like, and that was like my college time. So like, you know, while other people had to, you know, do this on top of regular schoolwork, that was my schoolwork. So like, I was able to spend a lot of time like designing, getting feedback. I was like one of the only people who played role-playing games in my department, other than like some underclassmen who played a lot of 5e. And like none of my professors knew what the fuck I was doing. They were like, okay. Like we get, but they knew interaction, they knew play, they knew like a bunch of these wonderful things. So like I was able to talk to them through concepts of play and mechanics, and then like, you know, talk about and introduce role-playing. And then like, so that's, and then as I left college and I made Space Between Stars, at least to the state that it is today, I then found the itch world. And then like now it is actually history. Like, so like that's kind of my whole journey. I used to give an introduction and I just took you through my lore.
I love it. Listen, the show is for you. It's to give you a voice, and it's to give you imagery in different spaces to people that may not be even aware that you exist. As is also myself. Amazing. I love all of that. You know, as I've said multiple times on the show, my first touchstone has always been, I played that for like 2 or 3 years. When I first started thinking about designing things, it was D&D supplements. It was trying to create the next D&D. When I first played Blades in the Dark, well, after I had been playing Blades in the Dark for like a couple months, I was like, okay, what if I ported D&D 5e into Blades in the Dark and made like a fighter playbook and stuff like that. But eventually I came across, you know, like the Brain Trust Discord and all the different types of games, and, you know, learning about stuff like this Discord has ghosts in it, and learning about Chair, and learning about the former being by Will Yopes and Adam Vass, and then the latter being by Adira Slattery, for anyone who may be listening to this as their first episode. It just, again, like you, it just blew my mind open, like, what is a game? And it's not just like a 600-page, 3-volumed product. It can be other things and be just as fulfilling.
I think like that's like my driving force is like I think the thing is like I never want to define what is a game. I want to continually explore what is a game. You know, I never want to find that answer. Never give me the answer of what is a game. You know what I mean? Because I'll just say you're wrong. Kind of aggressive, but I'm like, you know, like the fun of it. Like I think the game of game design, the play of game design, is that you are constantly searching for what is a game, and you're trying to find what your definition of it is. You're trying to find what other people's definition of what it is. And so like when you broaden your horizons, when you like are accepting of other ideas and like of diverse voices and like various things, you're like, oh, you know what I mean? Like there is like it's the joy of always learning, you know what I mean? Yeah. And it's like, you know, spaces like the Brain Trust and stuff like that. Actually, I just remembered, I mentioned the Wind Up Space. That's where Adam Vass and I first met. We met at a Baltimore convention called RPG Fest. It was really tiny. And so like we met there, and then like that's how I got into the Brain Trust. Was like Adam and I kind of kept in touch briefly, and like we were talking about stuff, and then eventually it was like, oh, I'm like doing this thing, like I'm working on this Kickstarter, and we worked together, and then like the Brain Trust happened, and then I was like, oh, I'm good friends with Adam and Tyler, who's also a great member of the Brain Trust and frequent editor for Adam Vass's work, and also has edited my game. So like, yeah, it was like, it's again like these like keep yourself open and you know, find differences and stuff.
I love it. It's what an amazing journey, for sure. Well, let's transition into the meat of the show. Let's get some game design out there. Let's dissect some shit. As if anyone who hasn't noticed and has been listening to the show for a long time, you might have seen that I've been adding slice and dice to all of my interviews to separate them from like devlog and transparent reflections. So now I have like 10 shows under my name. I don't know.
Good.
But
Do it.
Welcome to the main point of slice and dice.
Hell yeah.
Name pending.
I am a big fan. No, Jeremy, I'm a huge fan because like I literally call like, you know, my streams and my podcast, I call it the Viditya Voleti variety show, because I never want to do the same thing twice. Like it is So it's like I always give something a name. It's always something different. I'm like, do it.
I'm here for it. The first game we're going to talk about today, real quick, since we're in the beginning of the show, and I forgot to tell you to do this in your introduction, where can people find you, talk to you, find your stuff?
Yeah.
Because there's no guarantee that they're going to make it to the end of this episode and find out where that is.
Okay, yeah, sure. Sorry, I should have also said that. Yeah, so like you can find me. Oh, I also forgot to say my pronouns. I go by he, him. Jesus. Yeah. Oh, welcome to the start of this show, everybody. So this is how I got into tabletop games. No, I'm sorry. So you can find me on Twitter. You can find me, and you can find my games at vidityavoleti.itch.io. Like Jeremy was saying, and like I just said, like I have a bunch of different small endeavors, so you can find all of that. You will always find me on the internet under Viditya Voleti. Like I am lucky and blessed to have a great name for SEO. But like you can follow all that stuff on my Twitter. I think it's like the easiest way to say it right now. Also, like I am a cast member on All Nerds Here, which is a wonderful Twitch channel that has a great queer and diverse cast. And yeah. And also and I'm also on the Musafir's podcast, which is also a wonderfully diverse and queer actual play podcast that takes place in the Sarzamine campaign. So it is close to home because it's a South Asian inspired setting.
Perfect.
Yeah,
perfect.
Those are places.
Thank you. Now, let's talk about Space Between Stars. The thesis game. Let's many times?
I can talk about that forever. I have a slideshow. I should take you through a thesis slideshow.
Right now.
Yeah. Slideshows work great in audio only format, right?
Yeah, as you can see here in this diagram. So why don't you give, for the folks at home who may not be aware of the game or what it is, give a brief introduction of Space Between Stars.
Yeah, so Space Between Stars is a role-playing game about who you are and where you're going, is its little tagline. It's a GM-less space opera game. And it uses its own system. So I built the system up from the ground up. It is a game about the who you are part is like it's very character centric. So you like create a member, like you create a character who is a member of a crew. So like its touchstones are very Star Wars, like Firefly, Star Trek, like these things where like you are a member of a crew. I would say Star Trek a little like less so because it's like Cowboy Bebop is like a big one. I think like every game I make has like a little bit of Cowboy Bebop in it.
Love it.
But yeah, like these things where you're like, oh, we have a ship that is our home, and we all have our own little problems that we fix or like, exacerbate or talk through or work out through adventure. But that adventure is really just a plot piece moving forward. It's like the game is very episodic. So like it's just like a plot piece moving forward to, have personal growth and inter-character growth is the thing. That's like the themes of it. The nitty gritty of it is that like the mechanical stuff is like it's an opposed dice pool system. It uses like it has like a whole mechanic of like you can either on your turn, so everybody kind of goes around and has control of the scene, and you're playing like a linear story more or less. So like you can set up the scene however you want, and you're writing down prompts and things on flashcards. They're called threads. Mm-hmm. So a thread can be you're introducing a new character to the scene, you're introducing a new location to the scene, or like a conflict. So you can say like, oh, this is like now I'm like introducing a thing where dice should be rolled. And the way the dice roll is like each character has a bunch of different categories of stuff, and they all add dice to a dice pool in different ways. And a thing that I'm really proud of with Space Between Stars is the difficulty of a scene always starts out as like a singular difficulty. So it's like I said, and you're trying to roll higher than the opposing pool. So like difficulty always starts as 1d8, but then the challenge of the game is personal. So like your characters should always be able to overcome something unless it is personally challenging to them. So like there's a whole like hindrance mechanic where if something is challenging to your own character, then you inflate the difficulty pool. Like difficulty is optional, which is something I like and I think is pretty unique about it is, there's no like, oh, I'm trying to board the spaceship while I'm spacewalking, right? And like, like what's going on? The conflict here is that I can't get in. The difficulty is not determined by like how strong the door is and whether or not like you have the right tool for the job. You know what I mean? Like there's no like set difficulty for this kind of action. Instead, what you ask yourself is this pushing my character in a way that like is, like allowing them to like move on from past traumas or past issues. Like, you can have a hindrance that's like afraid of space, right? Like you hate being in space. So like you could be like, oh, this is difficult for me because my character is panicking. Like they're like, I want to get in and it's hard, versus somebody else who's just like, no, like I have a tool. We're just going to roll the dice as is and see what happens. So that's kind of Space Between Stars in a nutshell. So like it also has a pretty great session 0. Like it's built around a session 0. So it's got a world, like a galaxy builder. So the whole point is that like you sit down, you answer a bunch of questions as a table. The ethos of it is it's GM-less, so like everybody should be on the same page. Everybody should, like, I didn't write a setting for it. The table should be intimately aware of the setting that they are playing together, so they all kind of understand what's happening. You're all adding to it, so every time a thread is made, you pass the card along the table and everybody gets to add a little aspect to it, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so like that's kind of it. It's actually been a little bit since I pitched Space Between Stars, so I think that was a little all over the place, but yeah.
It was good. I loved it. One of the biggest things that you talked about mechanically that I find really interesting is sort of this player controlled difficulty. I know this is a GM full game in the sense that, or GM less, which way, either way you want to spin it, and where all the players have narrative control. But I like this concept because I think about games that do have a GM or narrator or whatever your chosen word for that type is, though I like narrator. We should use narrator, normalize it. Yeah. But this sort of like in control, like something that can, if it's personal for your character, right? And like say, let's just use D&D as the baseline because that's the current most popular role-playing game on the main media. So anyone listening to this can relate to that. And let's imagine that when you get a critical on a skill check, right? Define a key term about the setting right now. Like you as the player get to define something that means something to your character. And I think that is a really cool mechanic to consider for any game you sort of start making, because I definitely want to pick your game about your brain, not your game, but also your game. I want to pick your brain about sort of those concepts of interaction and play later in the show. But I don't know, that's just really awesome. I want that in my games. I want to be able to say like, you tell me what like if I'm the GM, you tell me what happens because you have the control right now.
Yeah, I like that is. So the reason why I was like, oh, let's talk about Space Between Stars, I guess, like you asked me like what game would I want to talk about, but pulling back the curtain, the reason why I like Space Between Stars and why I thought it would be a good game to talk about is because it is like a distillation of what I want to explore in design. And like it kind of exploded after that. Like all of my games after that are taking small aspects of it, or taking like a thing I wanted to explore with that and pushing like that aspect into its own direction. Or like, this was the catalyst for me thinking about this stuff. And like GM-less play is something that I think about a lot. Like I feel like that is something that like or like what it means to be a GM, like GM-less play or GM full play, right? Like my default, like, speaking of D&D, like a lot of people make games and like they're like, oh, an RPG has a GM, right? And either they don't really think, like either they don't really think about it, they go, an RPG has a GM, therefore, right? But then there's other things where it's like, oh, they understand what a GM does and like why it's necessary. But then I'm always like, but then my brain always goes to GM-less first. Like, so when I want to design a game, I'm like, oh, I need to think about a GM because it's easier for me to design GM-less. I'm losing myself a little bit, but I'm looping back.
We're here.
Yeah. So like the idea of Space Between Stars was that where like when I was running Pathfinder a lot, and when I was running like these like smaller games for friends, I was like, boy, I love being a part of like having control of the narrative to a degree, but I hate having all of this control of the narrative. So it was like this yeah, it's like, how do I give other people on the table like I don't want to be in charge all the time, right? I kind of did not want to be in charge all the time. So like, yeah, designing games where like you're alleviating control onto players in moments, right? Like, oh, you rolled a crit, introduce an element to the world. Like you did, like, I think like the joke that I say every once in a while is like, how do you do it? Right? Like the question, the D&D question, or like the Matt Mercer, how do you want to do it? Right? Like you get the final blow on a character, on an enemy, and you get to describe how you kill it, was like mind blowing for a bunch of people. People are like, oh my God, how do you do it? Like, I love that. And now I ask my players to do it all the time. And I'm like, that is such a bare minimum. Like the reason why that feels so powerful to players is because of that total narrative control that they aren't used to. And I'm not like, necessarily dunking on people who like that. I think it's great and you should do that. But what I'm saying is like, that is such like a, like the reason why people love, oh, how do you want to do it? Right. Is because they're like, I get to sit in the seat for a second, and that feels good. And especially for games like D&D where, you don't always want to be the GM, but as a player, you want those moments of being in the seat. You want those moments of being like I get to just unabashedly tell a story, right? And because you're like, the monster's dead, I get to say some really cool stuff. It doesn't even matter, right? Like, oh, how do I want to do it? There's some coal next to me and I toss it in its eyes and then I light my sword aflame and like the oil that it spilled out and then I, stab it through the eyes. And you're like, well, it's dead. You already made the roll. Just have fun, right? I'm like, how do I get people to feel that way all the time, basically? You know what I mean? Like, how do you... And yeah, so that was like... yeah, GM-less stuff, and like that like moment of freedom that you give players is so wonderful. And in Space Between Stars, it was like, how do you do that all the time, right? It's like, how do you always let people just kind of tell fun stories and then bring it up to a point where dice are rolled, and then dice are rolled to basically just add uncertainty. Like, technically you can play this game. Technically you can play any role-playing game by just telling a story with somebody, right? But like the point of a game is that you at some point engage with its mechanics, and those mechanics can be various things, right? Like, engaging with a lyric game's mechanics is like meeting it at its level, right? Like reading it and accepting what you're doing. So I don't always mean roll dice is play game.
Roll dice, therefore, is game.
Yeah, exactly. And so like what's the difference between a game and telling a story is like you're meeting it at its level. And with Space Between Stars is like, you could just go around and constantly like set scenes and talk to each other. And like the thing with control of difficulty is also control of progression. The game, because again, like you could play the game where you're just, the opposed pool is so small that there's a good chance that there's a better chance that you're going to succeed all the time, but there's always a chance you can fail, right? And like, but then like choosing to make that moment more difficult is like is basically telling to the table, you're like, I want to fail this. You know what I mean? I want the tension. And that's like, again, like a moment of power that I want players to understand, right? Like I want players who like are used to GM'd games to understand that like, oh, you have the power to say if something is difficult. You know what I mean? You have the power to and like you're not opposing this on somebody else, right? Like that's another important thing is you're not telling another player this is difficult for you. It is like your own choice to be like, I want to see failure happen, right? Yeah. And in turn, it's because I want to see my character grow after it, because Space Between Stars has a fail forward progression system. So like when you fail, you gain stress. You have to worry about how much stress you gain, but during downtime, you can spend stress to like increase the amount of dice you get and other things. Like you progress, like it's supposed to. So like I like when I play tested the game, I had like one campaign. We played about 5 sessions, and there was one character who kept failing. Like they kept pushing themselves and progressing and basically engaging with the mechanics, but like to a larger degree than say another player at the table who was. And it's like if we were using D&D terms, like by the end of our 5th campaign, like one person was like level 5 while the other one had stayed at level 1. But they were both enjoying the game, and just because one is rolling more dice does not mean that there's like an imbalance, right? Like, oh, you will just steamroll over these encounters while I have to struggle. Like the idea is like I just want to tell, like one player is just I want to just tell a fun story with my friends, right? And if I roll dice, I roll dice. Well, the other one is like I want to tell a fun story with my friends, but I also want to push my character. I want to engage with the mechanics, and it's very opt-in, right? Which again is like that. I think an important mindset that I want people who are used to GM'd games, like GM-ful games, to be like, oh, like this isn't the norm, or like you can think about interaction differently. Like there is no such thing as like this is a standard RPG, right? Like every RPG is very different, and therefore like you should be thinking about things differently.
So in the game I'm working on, Kaleidoscope, when you talk about GM-less, GM-full games, one of the big inspirations for its narrator basis is Band of Blades, and how Band of Blades takes these Legion officer roles to delineate administrative bookkeeping from the GM side, but it also gives, I think subtly, if you examine it a little deeper, it also gives narrative choice to the players as well, because you're basically setting prompts for the scene. So like the commander gets to pick the mission you go on and influence the type of missions that become available. The marshal gets to pick the squad and the specialists that go on. And that decision, like if you look underneath the hood, like sort of sets the tone for the mission. Like there's a difference between sending a heavy and a sniper versus a medic and an officer, along with the Chad Bros, the Ember Wolves, versus like the Smart Boys, Star Vipers, right? Like that's a completely different story on the same mission. And then the quartermaster makes, narrative decisions based on what downtime actions they select, because, we got to heal everyone's stress. We can throw a party and play out those role-playing scenes. So what I'm ultimately trying to make a point towards is that even if you, for the folks at home, maybe new designers or veteran designers looking for new inspirations or musings, as I say in the intro all the time, when you think about a GM-less, GM-full, or maybe like GM-lessened game, is that could also be a category. That's what I would consider Band of Blades, right? GM-lessened. There is this, when you put those mechanics out there, I think you're looking at adding narrative control in a lot of different places. It doesn't have to just be something very explicit that says you are in control of the scene, you do a thing, but it's also like you can do something that sort of subtly allows a player to change the narrative without them saying like, I changed the narrative. I just think that what I'm saying is that there's different stylistic ways of executing on GM-lessness.
Exactly. And like that's what like when I was making Space Between Stars, I did a lot of research on GM-less games, and I asked around, and people kept pointing towards the same games, right? They're like, oh, Fiasco's GM-less. This is how Fiasco works. And I pulled a little bit from Fiasco, and there's other ones. There are other ones. I can't believe I blocked them out of my head. Like for good reason. Well, but like it's because like there's like I found like a community of I'm like talking out of my mic. I found like a community of like when I initially was trying to break into tabletop communities, there was like a really bad, or to me, which I found really demoralizing, which was like, hey, like, oh, you're trying to make a GM-less game? Well, this exists, right? Like, oh, like this is how GM-less works. Like people always pointed towards like, oh, this is GM-less gaming, right? And that's also what I mean with like GM-full gaming, where it's like there's such a big spectrum. Like it's not like, or like when you break from the norm, the idea of like why mess with the GM-less structure when X already exists to let you do that? I'm going to use Fiasco. I think there was another example that people kept giving me, but like like in a kind of dismissive way. That's like, oh, this is like, oh, we've kind of like, you should just take how Fiasco does GMless and skin it in your own system. And I'm like, Fiasco does GMless in an interesting way, but it's not how I like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, it's not how I want to convey it. Like, you know, mechanics have narrative meaning, and the way the Fiasco's mechanics work is very like, you know, push and pull with everybody. But then like Space Between Stars is very collaborative. Like you're telling like a TV show versus like a Coen Brothers movie. You know what I mean? Like they're the way GMless feel, and say again, like same with GM-ful games, like, or like, you know, Band of Blades is a great example of like, oh, like it is, GM lessened is a great term for it, because you're like, it's like a GM, like PBTA is like GMs never roll dice. Right? That's like a big kind of, I think at least that's like a big mechanical through point for them.
Yeah.
Is that GMs never roll dice. And that's like a very interesting concept, because you're like, oh, players have uncertainty and GMs are there to push player uncertainty, right? Like there's like a, like you're pushing players to make the rolls, and players can fail. GMs never fail because GMs never roll, right? Like that's kind of the idea, versus something like an OSR, like a D&D game, where like an enemy can fail an attack roll on you. You know what I mean? While in like PBTA games, if you attack and you fail or get a partial, the enemy attacks you. Like it's on the player to control that narrative. And I'm like, that's vastly different. Like, you would never say like, oh, 5e exists, we don't need to mess with how GMs work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
You're
like,
blowing my mind by saying like the whole, because I never took the contrast of like, if it means that like saying that the GM can never fail because they're not rolling dice, they're not doing anything uncertain, they're merely just reacting to the player's choices, right? Whereas in D&D, the GM technically is a player, and I guess, you know, when you talk about GM antagonism, that might be why, because it's, you're also attempting uncertain action that affects the player's reactions, and you know, whether how you know whatever the GM style is determines that level of antagonism, but it's only created because of basically the GM's a player in D&D 5e, right? Like they're basically a rolling player. So you're widening my scope right now.
It's like, and to like focusing on that for just a quick second, like, you know, making a hard move and stuff like that in PBTA games is the GM mechanically interacting with the game. But like, from playing a bunch of PBTA games and playing with like a very good PBTA MC, Simon Moody, who I've played a bunch of PBTA games with, and he's a great MC for a lot of them. For all of them, I've played with him. It's like this idea of like, like why every PBTA game is you're a fan of the players is because, like, you know, you're not rolling dice against them. When you make a hard move against them, it is not to win, it is to push them, to be a fan of them, right? Like to like, you're listening and hearing, and you know, all of these theories you should take to other games as well. Like, you, like, being a fan of the players should also be in your D&D game, right? Like, it's not mutually exclusive, but how PBTA mechanically is structured reinforces that. Like an antagonistic, I would say like an antagonistic GM in 5e, if it's above the board, everybody understands this. Like, you're not like harassing your players. If I'm like, I'm going to play an antagonistic GM, I'm going to try and kill you. And the players are like, cool, right?
Yeah.
That to me is very acceptable in like OSR and trad games and stuff like that. But in like PBTA, I would be like, I mean, again, like above the board, like I'm going to try and kill you, sure. But like mechanically, I find it weirder if like if a GM is like, I'm going to play Monster of the Week and my whole job is to kill the players. I'm like, no, like, you know, your job, like when you make hard moves, it's to put your monster hunters in tough situations where they have to hunt monster, right? Not gunning to kill them.
Yeah.
because even like so like, you know, not rolling dice doesn't necessarily mean they never fail, but it's they choose to fail. Like they choose to bring in this element to push the players in a different direction. Well, you know, even in like I said, trad games, like the players can push mechanical stuff onto the GM by having enemies roll for saves and stuff like that, right? Like, oh, I'm going to throw a fireball. This hits unless you do something, and the GM is like, okay, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's like the same back and forth, right? There is kind of like a back and forth of mechanics that goes on. Fascinating.
yeah, absolutely fascinating. I love it. To sort of rein the boat back on the river of Space Between Stars as well. So one of the things that I found interesting, in addition to stress, is that you don't really have like, you do in a subtle way, I think, or at least if I'm on the same page. So the grief and hindrance is sort of like your HP for the game a little bit, right? Instead of HP, what were you trying to capture using that system?
Yeah, I think like that is something I thought about genuinely, where I was like on two fronts. So the stress track in Space Between Stars is called grief, because I wanted something that like is a little bit more punchy than just stress.
Sure.
Because I think like stress can come in a lot of ways, but like this is a game about reconciling with your past, right? Where like, and that's what your hindrances are. But I was thinking about about GM-less play, and I'm like, there is no person to guide the narrative. Everybody is guiding the narrative. So I never want to put players in a position where where a conflict is created, and that conflict is like we're in an argument, right? Like dice need to be rolled to figure out not even who wins the argument, but like how the argument plays out, right? Or like not even between players. This is like a PvP example, but I'll just say like, you know, you're just trying to negotiate with like a crime boss, like a syndicate boss. Failure should not mean that you are losing meat points, right? like grief is a way to say that like, you know, grief literally is like being shot puts you in like is grief, but also like kind of like, you know, being shut down is similarly a moment of grief, right? Like you're like, ah, shit, like I thought I was gonna do that, but then I got fucking rebutted, and now my like buds think I'm less because of that. But like, you know, like, even if they don't, but like you can like, grief is such like a broad idea. And then similarly, because the game is entirely built, because the world is entirely built up by the table, I really, really wanted to make sure that nothing in the game stopped you from playing what you wanted. So like you can create a character which is just a gaseous cloud that walks around, right? And I didn't want like HP to be like, this gaseous cloud has the same amount of meat points than this human, right?
Yeah.
And like it's just like terminology that I was like, I want to avoid the idea that like failing a check means that like grief and stress are like, they're universal. You could be a gaseous cloud, and for you, getting shut down in front of your buds doesn't bother you that much, right? Or like getting shot doesn't bother you, but being shut down in front of your buds is like, oh damn,
shit,
I'm feeling it, right? Like, and so like that's kind of the idea where I'm like, it's like even like harm, like, you know, like the stress track in Blades games, like that's where I kind of got the idea. I was like, I love this stress track, but then even in Blades you still have harm because the game puts you in physical danger, but. In every game of Space Between Stars I've played, I've never gotten in a shootout.
Heard.
Like players, and like it depends on what players you're talking about, but like my players have never gotten in a shootout. So like grief just means like, you know, when you roll dice, when you fail, you take grief because you're being put in a situation that like you don't like you failed at something and it shouldn't feel that way. So yeah, that's kind of like the major through line with that was like narrative freedom for you to be like, failure means something, but it doesn't matter what I failed at. You know what I mean?
It's definitely where HP or vitality on one point is that a game designer is still a writer at the end of the day, and the words you choose to describe a thing carry different amounts of baggage to them, right? The difference between calling, I'm quoting in the air for anyone that can't see me, quote unquote, HP, right? Or calling it grief, or calling it stress, or calling it fortitude, or calling it like, and what that delineates to the type of stories your game is telling, or what you're trying to say with the game, right? Even as you're talking about it, I'm thinking about Kaleidoscope and how, like, I don't want to do HP. I want it to mean something. Yeah. And on a side tangent, you were talking about using clocks as playbooks in the Brain Trust like 2 days ago or something like that.
Yeah.
And blew my mind, because I was like, okay, what if, like, you had, because I'm playing with this thing in Kaleidoscope called thresholds, where, like, you put little shorthand acronyms inside the ticks. Mm-hmm. And when you hit that tick, something triggers in the narrative. So, like, why can't we have, like, crucial HP that means something for the player, right? Like, put in your own shorthand and say, okay, when I have 2 ticks on my 8 clock, I'm now nervous. When I have 4 ticks in, I'm panicking, or something like that. Like, just based on what you want your character to have. So I find I love grief, and I love what you were trying to accomplish with grief for Space Between Stars.
Yeah, I always say, sorry. No, but I do actually always say this. I say, like, the words you choose are really important, right? Like, you're you have your 6 stats in any trad game, but you, like, replace charisma with like, sorry, I'm trying to think of a word, with, like, fucking
gusto.
Yeah, honestly, that's a good one. I was going to say lying, but there's a better word than just lying. But, like, gusto, right? Suddenly, that word, that stat makes like, you know, charisma could be rolling for gusto, right? Like, oh, I'm trying to, like, show off. Roll charisma, right? But if you say the stat is gusto, suddenly, like, everyone on the table understands, like, oh, I have a stat for showing off, for being cool, you know, or, like, trying to present in such a way. And it, like, you know, it means a lot, right? Like, when you omit strength and instead put, like, well-being, you omit constitution and you put well-being, right? Like, technically, constitution could mean well-being, but, like, when you, or, like, the other way around, but, like, because mechanically, it's like, oh, you roll constitution when you eat bad food, when you poison, when you're, like, tired, right? Like, all this stuff. But, like, well-being suddenly gets a lot of people to think about, like, oh, like, how does my character feel? Like, literally, like, how do they feel? Like, mental well-being suddenly becomes a part of that, right? Like, you can kind of add all of these things. So, you know, it's, what words you choose, I think, are, like, really important, and I have nothing wrong with the words that people use, that have been using, right? Like, the 6 stats are completely fine with, but, you know, like, that should never be your baseline. Like, always kind of think about, like, what is HP? What is it tracking? What does it mean when you tell a player you have health points, right? Even if they mean the same thing as grief, like, even if, like, narratively you lose HP for losing an argument as you would a sword, like, in equal parts, like a sword fight. The fact that, like, it's called HP, to me, like, and, you know, other people might disagree, but, like, to me goes, oh, I have to worry about dying, right? But, like, grief, when I max out on grief, that does not mean that I die. It means that I'm depressed. You know what I mean? Like,
tired, I'm done, I quit.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it does not mean it's the end of the road for me. It means that, like, I've just kind of hit this point where maybe I just can't take another step forward. Like, you know, and this is, like, another big part of Space Between Stars, I think, is I might be moving into another direction, but, like, that was really important to me. Like, Space Between Stars is a game that I made after I had just taken a year off of college because I was terrified of, you know, my abilities and, like, the pressures of academia and, like, various other stuff. And so, like, Space Between Stars being a game about failing forward was really important to me, because it was almost like I was, like, taking a year off was not me failing, right? Like, you know, doing bad in college was not me failing and stopping. You know what I mean? Like, I need to keep moving forward, and, like, grief being this thing that you accumulate and then spend to get better is, like, mechanically supposed to supposed to reflect kind of that processing state of dealing with actual like real life grief and things like that, right? You're like, oh, I got, it's like, why am I so filled with like grief and like stress? And when you take some time to sit down and like kind of think about it, when you take time to, be with people that you love and just decomp, or like all of these things, like you come out a better person because of it is like kind of what I had to like tell myself and what I had to channel into my work. I was like, no, like my hindrances as a character, like if I were to make my own playbook, my hindrances would be like, I would say like, I'm constantly struggling with ADHD. Like I have like very bad, like my hindrances are like, I'm really bad at keeping up with people. Like, people are like, hey, have you been? Like, we haven't talked in a few months. And I'm like, oh my God, you know what I mean? Like, where did this time go? And I feel really bad. And like all these different things and, like various traumas and like neurodivergencies. And these aren't bad things. I think I speaking of like words, I did not want to call hindrances flaws. I think hindrance is like kind of a clunky word, but I did not want to call them flaws. I explicitly didn't. I want to say like these are things that they're speed bumps. You know what I mean? They're things that like are hindering you, but you being like me having ADHD is not a flaw in my character. It is something that I have to fight. And again, like the idea that a hindrance is opt-in, like even if a situation makes sense, like I mean, this is Space Between Stars is a space opera, so a lot of these are also like my hindrance is I let my partner die in the hands of the enemy, like like my trauma is I let like, oh, the Empire killed my partner and I was like I led to that, you know what I mean? Like the past I'm trying to get rid of, like trying to not face, right? Is this betrayal that I made. Like it's dramatic, but the idea is like you as a player and you as a character should choose to confront it, right? And the only way to progress, like the only way to get better at the game mechanically is to push yourself, is to say, I'm in a situation where this hindrance would be triggered and I can choose not to. I could just be like, I don't want to deal with it, right? But I can also choose mechanically to be like, yes, this is difficult for me, and then like increase the amount of difficulty dice. And even that scaling, like you can add between 1 to 4 dice to your pool. So like you can like be like, this is really fucking with me and throw all those dice in. Or just like, just a little bit. Like, yeah, this is a challenge, but like I could probably get through it. It's not like I'm facing the person who killed my partner. You know what I mean? It's just reminding me of that. And I think like that's the important thing, because like if you fail, you're not failing, right? Like you're like let's say you choose to engage with dealing with your hindrances and it doesn't work out, right? But the point is that like that grief then lets you process, right? Like then you get to like take the time to process. And also it is still successful. Like, if you succeed at it, you get bonus dice. Like you slowly move towards getting rid of that hindrance. Like you slowly, like succeeding and failing still are part of processing. Like there's something like very recently I've been thinking a lot about fail forward systems, and I'm like, I love them. And I, made Space Between Stars a game that's entirely about failing forward, but also I want to celebrate success maybe in design a little bit more. Not like, you know what I mean? Like give that same kind of like love to like, oh, I'm trying to challenge myself and I succeed and that feels great. Like I did it, right? Like I shouldn't only be progressing because of failure and so on. So yeah, that's also like kind of a big part of that grief cycle that I wanted to design with that game was like, sometimes things suck and sometimes you gotta confront it. And in doing so, in a fun space opera game, you get to have a character that like, in my opinion, I think like feels human. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much for being vulnerable on the show. I appreciate that a lot. There's nothing you've said that we don't get real here on Draw Your Dice. So I love it. Almost spit water. I saw it.
Yeah. You do get real, Andre.
Amazing. Hey everyone, Jeremy here. Viditya gave us so much jam-packed information, that I had to break up this episode into 2 parts. So you're getting part 1 this week, and you'll be getting part 2 next week. 60 minutes of Viditya goodness. Look forward to it. As always, you can catch me at JeremyGage5 over on Twitter if you have any questions. Use the hashtag IDIDIT, that's IDYDIT. Please check out my Venmo and Ko-fi, and if you like what I'm doing, let me know. Thank you, and say hello to Viditya for me. Bye!